Hi, my name is Andrew Sears, and I'm the president of City Vision University. And this is a recording of a presentation that I'm going to be giving at the Citygate 2021 conference. Citygate works with hundreds of rescue missions and other largely evangelical ministries that work with the poor. And a lot of these ministries, people from these ministries, I ask them, do you live and work in dangerous neighborhoods? And they're willing to live and work in neighborhoods that many people would consider extremely dangerous. I ask people, have you been robbed in those neighborhoods? And most people haven't. And the reason why is because, one, they've learned to be street savvy. They've learned where the risks are. But I often like to ask people, why are you willing to take these risks and work in neighborhoods that, people might consider more risky? And, one of the responses I get, some of it's a call, but the other response I get is that we are to be in this world, but not of this world. Now, I worked in urban ministry in Boston for 20 years. And in that, our headquarters was in a neighborhood that was about a mile walk from the subway station, the Ashmont train station. And there were two paths that you could walk in coming there. And one of the things we worked with a lot of interns, a lot of volunteers, and we'd train people and we'd say, this path that you see here, don't take this at night, because this is known as a path where a lot of people get robbed. There's not very good lighting, and you shouldn't take this path. And we would say, take this path if you're going to be going, in the evening, and you should be safe. Now, part of the reason why I use that example is we work with a lot of people who they're willing to go and work in at-risk neighborhoods, but they're not willing to go and work in, and think about topics and engage in topics that might be dangerous intellectually or might be difficult to talk about intellectually. And ultimately, I think that, that's not what we're called to do as Christians. I think that as Christians, we are called to have difficult conversations. Having a race conversation in the United States is a very difficult conversation. It's easy to go down the wrong neighborhood. It's easy to get assaulted by people on the left or the right. And part of the reason why I wanted to give this talk is, if you understand my background, then you can understand that. So a little of my background, I grew up attending white evangelical churches and schools, but I also grew up attending black churches. My dad was a white minister in an all-black church. I grew up in a racially mixed neighborhood. My first experience working in ministry was at an evangelical rescue mission called City Union Mission in Kansas City. My spiritual formation in ministry came largely through rescue missions, but also significantly through the Christian Community Development Association and the Black Church. So my organization, Tech Mission, which is the parent organization to City Vision, for most of our history, about 2/3 of our staff and board have been Black and Latino. There were seasons where I was the only white person, and that just felt normal to me. But the reality is, over the past few years, I feel like I have these two parents, the white evangelical and, the Black and Latino parents, two divorced parents. They won't talk to each other. And I remember the good old days whenever John Perkins was a keynote speaker at Promise Keepers events and racial reconciliation was cool. Now you say the words racial reconciliation, and the far right accuses you of imposing critical race theory on them, and the far left says it's a term that's too slanted towards white people. And I've experienced this myself. We've been teaching the same material for 15, 20 years, and only in the past year have I had people come to me and say, oh my gosh, that's critical race theory. And almost universally, it's people don't even know what they're talking about. So part of the goal is to try to help inform the discussion. One of our biggest strengths at City Vision University is helping others to grow in their cultural intelligence. And just to give you a little bit of background, so City Vision University started as a part of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions. It was the education arm of that. But it was taken over, and so it got accredited in 2005, and it was taken over in 2008 by Tech Mission, the organization which I started, which is a Christian community development organization, which grew largely out of CCDA. And one of our core competencies has been helping grow others in their cultural intelligence. So that's really why I wanted to do this, is help provide a little more information to this. So what I want to do is help people navigate the critical race theory conversation, give some of the big picture and origins. So one thing to understand is that critical race theory largely is in the social sciences field. Now, it tries to, there's people in there that try to argue that it covers all fields, but like many academic disciplines, it tries to say that the entire world revolves around it, and it doesn't necessarily work that way. But it's largely within the social sciences field. One other field where there's been a lot of controversy with Christianity is just the field of psychology. And then you have especially among rescue missions and those that work in Christian recovery, 20, 30 years ago, it used to be extremely controversial to talk about recovery and to talk about clinical psychology, clinical counseling. But now there are a lot of Christians that help to translate that into a Christian worldview, so that you can kind of, keep the meat and spit out the bones, the parts that aren't necessarily Christian. And the same thing's true in sociology, which is another big field, and, overlapping with that is the field of critical theory. And critical theory largely originated in German academic circles, initially as a critique of Hitler's Nazism. Now, a lot of people like to say that critical theory is, strongly tied to Marxism, and, it's in this field related to sociology and social sciences, and everything in there is kind of interrelated, but it does have some relation in the materialist worldview that Marxism has, but there's also a lot of differences, and a lot of people, on the right like to emphasize the Marxist roots, while people on the left like to emphasize the fact that it was actually originated to criticize Hitler's Nazism. And it largely emerged, so critical race theory largely emerged in the 1980s, and it's self-defined by one of the leaders as a collection of critical stances against the existing legal order from a race-based point of view. So it started off in out of law, which in many ways is comes out of the social sciences, but is more an applied profession, and then has expanded into other social sciences. So where did all this controversy come from on critical race theory? Why did it become a major issue? Now, if you actually look at the history, my understanding is the history is that, before 2000, there was almost no, discussion. It was just this kind of internal discussion that was happening among academics. And then the Manhattan Institute funded an initiative to focus on and funded a leader that, he said, what we're trying to do is we're trying to rebrand all the cultural insanities that are happening in the United States under critical race theory. So they tried to rebrand basically anything people didn't like. So it's my understanding that made its way up to Trump. And then in September 2020, President Trump released a White House memo on how critical race theory was dangerous. And then since then, it's been taken up in largely, red state or Republican state battles over critical race theory in education. And part of the reason why it's been getting promoted is it gets a lot of traction on social media. It's the ideal social media thing where it's going to polarize people. So what I really want to focus on is the big picture of critical race theory. So one is that critical race theory is one of hundreds of frameworks for understanding race. It's popular in secular academic circles. It isn't the only framework. It might like to think, there are leaders there that would like to, and they say their stated goal would be to establish the orthodoxy in academia on race, but it hasn't established itself as that, and a lot of people don't think it's anywhere near that. So the reality is that the controversy around critical race theory is driven by polarization from social media and politics. So everything, you all have been on social media. You've seen the polarization. You've seen the polarization that's happened in politics. So it's one of those issues that, the algorithms at Facebook and other places, show that it really upsets people whenever you see this. So you click on the link about critical race theory, and that generates more money for them. The third point is that framing the discussion primarily through controversy around critical race theory largely shuts down a very important discussion that needs to happen in race in the United States. And the fourth point is, I've listened to a lot of the Christian criticism and controversies around critical race theory, and they largely apply to the other social sciences. So whenever I looked at some of the most visible critiques, most of their critiques would apply over other social sciences. So if they want to throw out the entire domain of social sciences, that's one thing. But in a lot of them also is similar controversy over counseling and psychology. So the main point that I really want to make is whenever Paul, he in Timothy, he said, don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments, because they produce quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome and must be kind to everyone, be able to teach and not resentful. I believe that this passage, every time we load up Facebook, we should have this passage over our computer monitor, over our phone, because many of you have been a part of these foolish arguments. And I'm not saying there aren't really important issues that come up in this that are important to discuss from both sides of the perspective, but the way the critical race theory has been framed, it really biases the conversation so that 99% of the conversations that are happening on this really look like they're violating 2 Timothy. So my goal is to try to get us out of that mode of being stuck. And one of the examples I want to use is how Christians have made progress on this conversation around counseling and Christianity. It used to be that any counseling was viewed as the devil, any psychology was viewed as the devil. I think a more helpful framework is looking at what is your role in the kingdom. So are you playing a role that is focused on, the church gathered, like you're at a Christian ministry or at a church, so you're in this kind of not of the world, or are you in the church scattered, so you're in the world? And there's different ways of being in the world, intellectually, physically, serving the poor, serving, cross-culturally. And part of what we use a book called 5 Approaches to Counseling in Christianity. And, the conclusion we come to in our course is that which of these approaches you use kind of depends on your context. So if you are in a church, then biblical counseling probably really makes a lot of sense in, a church. But if you are a counselor in a secular organization, then you're going to have to use some of these other models. And then you have groups in the middle. And what's happened is there's been thousands of books that have been written that really have assessed what can we learn from the field of counseling, what can we integrate into Christianity, what should we exclude, and there's been a lot of learning in that domain. Now, part of what we want to resist in this conversation with the social sciences is the dualism heresy. So the dualism heresy is that there's this huge secular and sacred divide. And on the sacred side, you have your personal beliefs. You have to keep, separate from, other beliefs, your church and your religion, Sunday service, these are all sacred. And then you have secular things, counseling, psychology, sociology, all the social sciences, science, the other 6 days. And one of the leaders of the theology of work movement, Paul Stevens, said that the secular sacred dualism is the worst heresy of the Christian church worldwide. The reality is that biblically, the whole world is sacred and under God. There's several passages you can reference: Ephesians 4:6, Isaiah 6:3, Psalm 139:8. And ultimately, what we're called to do as Christians is to redeem the world, not just to say, "Oh, that's horrible." That is from the devil. What we're called to do is to redeem the world. So you take the secular social sciences. So and there's a lot of people who Christian sociologists, Christians in psychology, and they're the church scattered. If you're a Christian at Harvard, I went to school at MIT, so I understand. So I've not only worked and lived among the poor, but I've worked, I've been among the intellectual elite. And how do you engage in dialogue, with them? That's something that's important. And, there's some people who would say you have to avoid all this, but, should we have Christians in Hollywood? Should we have Christians in academia? We need people who are engaging on these topics. But what we also need is to translate these into a Christian worldview. So that's a lot of what the Christian community development movement's done. There's been a ton of books that focus on how do you have Christian identity with cultural identity, a lot of writing around cross-cultural ministry. And then you have these things that I would say are inadequate translations. In many ways, what happens is the Christian faith gets assimilated. So the social gospel, or Christians where their secular worldview is really their dominant worldview, or they have other identities that are greater than their Christian identity, or their identity in Christ is probably a better way of framing that. So let me just summarize part one before I go into part two. So political leaders of both parties are really trying to manipulate you and your constituents to be a part of their political agenda. They understand how to use social media to manipulate people. There are a lot of people that I've seen, people who are not affiliated with any church, with any Christian organization. They have their own vlog on YouTube. They're getting 100,000 views. But if you actually look at their theology, it's whack. There's no basis to it, and they're kind of fear mongers. So avoid that. Stay focused on your mission and on Scripture. So if your mission is to serve the homeless, to serve the addicted, to serve the poor, focus on that mission. Recognize that we need to grow in cultural intelligence. Now, the Bible is an amazing source to grow in cultural intelligence, and it should be our primary source, I believe. But also, in our whole worldview should be based around the Bible. But one source of learning is the secular social sciences translated into a Christian worldview. And, tying this back to my introduction, translating learning from secular social sciences into a Christian worldview is like learning to be street savvy while living in a dangerous neighborhood. So it's a dangerous thing. I've seen many of my friends who, they're strong Christians. They went into academia, or they went into engage, in the world scattered, and they ultimately got assimilated by that group. The forces to assimilate out Christian identity are pretty strong. So I use this to provide kind of a big picture framework. So what I want to do next is talk about what is a framework for growing in cultural intelligence while retaining a Christian worldview. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Christian worldview. There's a couple books that have been written, The Universe Next Door, Hidden Worldviews. If you ever attend a Christian college or university, you're going to hear a lot of talk about Christian worldview. And ultimately, you have Christian worldview, and you have what I would say is the dominant secular social science worldview. Now, this isn't to say everyone in the social sciences follows this, because there's multiple schools there, but it's what I would say is generally going to be the dominant worldview. So the base worldview is Christian versus secular scientific naturalism. I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but what a worldview does is it answers some of the fundamental questions. So what's the fundamental problem? It's sin. Whereas secular social science worldview says it's social or psychological. So an example might be unequal power. And this might be an example of sin, but biblically we're saying it's sin. Now, what's a solution? Is salvation, whereas secular social science might say, the solution is some sort of social solution or a counseling solution, or ultimately trying to readjust power. And again, that might be a part of not just our individual salvation, but a group salvation, but it isn't a substitution. And who are we? So we're in God's image, but fallen. Our primary identity is in Christ. Science says we're just thinking animals, collection of atoms. Social science says our primary identity is our social or group identity. Where we came from, God, accidental, cosmic chance. Philosophy, spiritual, holistic, materialistic, generally postmodern. What is truth? The Bible, plus general revelation. So that's recognizing, a lot of theologians, they call this general revelation, where you can learn truths from science and other domains. Whereas in a lot of the social sciences, they say that truth is entirely socially constructed. So that's one of the foundations of critical race theory. Values are Bible-based, and in many ways, social sciences pretends to be value-free, but it's not, right? And then how should I live? The summary of the Bible is love God, love others. And then depending on what social science you look at, psychology might say individual pleasure maximizing, or sociology might say social activism. So that's one way of framing this. So how do we translate these things into a Christian worldview? Learn from these things, but not adopt their worldview. And the worldview in many ways is the big picture perspective on things. It's the unstated assumptions within a field. Now, another way of thinking about this, so as a university president, I think a lot about how universities are typically organized. And you can kind of deconstruct secular universities, but the topics in universities go down a spectrum of very focused on the individual versus very focused on the collective. And then you have fields that are more internal focused and more subjective, and then fields that are more external. So I'm not going to go into all the domains, but you have humanities and the personal social sciences here. You have science and technology over here. You have the cultural, studies and different things over here. And then you have societal and social sciences. Now, within this, you have different fields. You have sociology and social work. You have political science, politics, and law. So, I'm relating the academic fields to the professions that often build on those. So you have economics, you have history, you have ecology. And what's important is to recognize that by the nature of the field, if you're in this quadrant, you're going to focus more on the individual and more on the internal experience. Where if you're down here, let me just use an example. Physics is focused on the external objects, the external aspects of things. You're not asking, how does an atom feel whenever it rotates, right? Whereas with a person, you're asking, what's their internal experience, right? And a lot of these things, they're looking at the external experience. So that informs the overall worldview. But what's important to recognize is what we're trying to do as Christians is we're trying to translate all of these into a Christian worldview. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, what some people will say is the Christian worldview is in this top left quadrant, but I think it's more complicated than that. I'm not going to get into all the details of that. But so all that is framing the conversation of what is critical race theory. So, if you want, I'm not going to try to substitute this book. There's an introduction to critical race theory at Secular that you can read that will kind of give you an overview. So those in the field have defined it as a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. So, this definition defines it as an activist movement, essentially. Some of the stances of critical race theory are that racism is pervasive in American society, creating an unlevel playing field. Second, because racism is most often concealed, critical race theory is skeptical of claims with neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy. Subjective experience of people of color is important to understand racial inequality. Racism is part of interlocking systems of oppression understood through intersectionality. And critical race theory provides an alternative minority perspective across a variety of largely social science disciplines. So coming back to this chart back here, it's largely in this quadrant, some in other quadrants, but largely in this quadrant. And it's basically trying to provide a race-based lens on that quadrant that provides an alternative minority perspective. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize is just that critical race theory in many ways is a secular intellectual response to a perceived unequal playing field. So you have a lot of leaders and academics that they're saying, how do we set up the definitions of the discussion so that we can counter the fact that this is the playing field right now. And they're saying, if the field's already tilted, how do we create definitions that will untilt the field, essentially, is what they're trying to do. This is my attempt, very poor attempt, to try to untilt the field. The reality is that's part of the challenge of critical race theory, is that critical race theory is trying to, in many ways, to be biased to offset what is perceived as a pre-existing bias. The result is that you'll get something that's more balanced. Now, the question that you have to start with to even understand, how are you going to feel about critical race theory is this what the playing field is like in the United States? And ultimately that comes down to a question of, what do you think about institutional racism? So Barna is one of the main groups that does surveys of Christians. They did a survey of Christians in 2019, and they really were getting at the question of which is the bigger problem, personal racism or institutional racism. And what was telling is the black population was 67% said that institutional racism was the bigger problem, whereas the white population, 61%, said personal racism. And there's, what is that, a 32 or 42 point gap between those two. So there's just a difference of experience. And, having lived in communities of color, a lot of that just has to do with, if you've experienced how systems, create problems, then you might have, this perception. So I'm not going to get into all the details on that, but so let me just use some examples of controversial stances out of critical race theory. A lot of critical race theory's most controversial stances come out of the materialist collective worldview that's pervasive in the social sciences. So as I mentioned, they're trying to use language and framework to offset an unequal playing field in larger society. They're working to create what I would say is a minority culture framework to offset what's perceived as inherently biased dominant framework. So one of the controversial stances is that people of color are not racist because they do not systematically benefit from racism. Where that's coming from, now I'm not going to get into all the detail. Do you agree or disagree with these statements? But where this is coming from, it's coming from a worldview that we are primarily defined by our collective identity. Same thing in terms of the statement, if you're a white in a white supremacist society, you're a racist. Again, that's coming out of a worldview that our guilt is primarily defined by our collective identity. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but what's helpful is to understand where this is coming from. This is coming from, some of it's the worldview, some of it is trying to offset, existing biases. So now I want to talk a little bit about biblical justice. So one of the best people theologically that I've seen on biblical justice is Tim Keller. And he wrote an article about critical race theory and secular justice. And he talked about what he views as 5 values of biblical justice. So the first one is community, that others have a claim on my wealth, so I must give voluntarily. The second is equality, that everyone must be treated equally and with dignity. The third is corporate responsibility. I am sometimes responsible for and involved in other people's sins. You could think of slavery as an example, with white folks, but, where there's unjust laws that we benefit, that someone might benefit from, that, and that we allow to happen, that could be a part of that. Individual responsibility. I'm finally responsible for all my sins, but not for all my outcomes. There's plenty of examples in the Bible where people don't sin, but they have negative outcomes. Job's a good example of that. And the fifth one is advocacy. We must have special concern for the poor and the marginalized. And you can read his article on this where he goes in a lot more depth, or you can read his book, Generous Justice, that doesn't talk about this specifically, but provides an overall framework. Now, the last thing I want to talk about on this that I think part of what I'm trying to do is diffuse some of the, energy that's going to make this conversation not helpful. I want to provide one more perspective on this. So this is a theological perspective, an evangelical theological perspective, on this. But another perspective comes from trauma-informed. So, as I mentioned, this talk is for Citygate network. So a lot of people there that Rescue Missions and other similar ministries are working with, my guess is 95% of their clients have experienced significant trauma. So one of the big things that a lot of groups have been learning about is, what does it mean to be trauma informed? How, whenever someone explodes at you, do you understand what's happening on a trauma level, right? So many rescue missions have separate men's and women's residential recovery programs to increase safety. Many people at rescue missions would also say to prevent hookups. If you have someone who is recently addicted, they might have other addictions, sexual addiction or things along those lines. And but it's also to increase safety in terms of their recovery process. And it's important to recognize the significance of group trauma. And, how are we doing something similar? The same thing we might apply to men and women. So, what group trauma is, that's racial trauma, gender-based trauma, social class-based trauma. It could be, trauma experienced by veterans. And what happens is much of the conflict that happens on discussions around race is from group trauma being invalidated, because we've experienced different types of trauma, and it's hard to have a conversation about this stuff without triggering or invalidating someone else's trauma. So, for example, a woman with trauma from men, maybe it was experienced some sort of abuse from men in a co-ed group where doesn't feel safe to discuss their trauma. So most rescue missions get that might be an issue. But it may be less common for them to understand, what if someone's deepest trauma is a racial trauma, and then, they're in a recovery group and it's, white culture dominated with mixed races. And a lot of the people might be great in the group, but some people might deny the legitimacy of their trauma. For someone, so I'm a trauma survivor myself. The worst possible thing you can do, maybe not the worst possible, but one of the worst possible. One is to re-traumatize someone, but the second worst is to deny that person's trauma. They haven't shared this for their whole life, and then if they bring it up and then it gets denied, that's extremely painful. So recognize, that it can be difficult to have multiracial conversations. So I was a part of a reconciliation group, and we had people come together in large group, multiracial in large group. But whenever we went to small group, sometimes we did multiracial in small group. Sometimes we did, people of color in their own group, and to be able to process things. And sometimes that can be helpful in these conversations. So, another example, a white male who experienced social class-based trauma, being told it's not valid. So a lot of people experience horrific trauma that might come from their poverty background. And, if they're told that it's not valid because, someone has a critical race theory framework and they say only racial or gender-based trauma or legitimate group trauma, that's not going to be helpful. Or a white male veteran whose trauma is discounted in a critical race theory framework. One of the principles of recovery from trauma, I've done a lot of studying around trauma. It's best healed in a group with people recovering from similar trauma without a major risk of invalidation. So, one good book, especially for people of color on this, I was on the board of a ministry by Sheila Wise Rowe, and she wrote one of the best books on race that I've seen. But this book, Healing Racial Trauma, it's really written by people of color for people of color to help validate their experiences. So I read it as a white person, recognizing I wasn't necessarily, the intended audience, for that, but it also was helpful for me to recognize that, it's hard to argue with someone's story. So with that, the next thing that I want to talk about is, I said one of the things we need to do is to stay focused on your mission while addressing racial injustice. So, some organizations could have this consume their mission, and other organizations could not touch on it enough because, if you're serving at-risk populations or you're serving the homeless or the addicted, and race isn't a part of the conversation, especially if the majority of, the people you're serving are people of color, that you're not going to be as effective as you could be. So, so one of the things I want to talk about, in the same way you can talk about a spectrum of conversation on, different ways of viewing counseling, you can also have a spectrum of Christian understanding of race. And here I have on the left a nearly all white environment, and here I have an environment that's nearly all non-white. And, so over here you might have some groups that are, separatist, fundamentalist, white fundamentalist churches. And, there's a good number of Christian schools that were a part of the Bob Jones network that, in even into the 70s and 80s were not allowing interracial dating. And in many ways, these are groups that are doing more of fear mongering that is, anti-biblical. And then you have white evangelical churches and ministries. So a lot of rescue missions might fall into this category, that they aren't all white, but they're, very, white dominant. And then you have other ministries that are highly multi-ethnic. They're evangelical or, some because the evangelical term has kind of got rebranded by Trump. Some people are using the term Bible-based churches or ministries, and this is Christian community development. That's InterVarsity, highly multi-ethnic rescue missions. There's a good number of rescue missions that are highly multi-ethnic. And then you have working class, Black, first generation Hispanic, first generation Asian American Bible-based churches. So I attended a Latino or Latina church that was more in this domain. And then you have the upper middle class, Black, second generation, Latinx. Generally, that's a term that's preferred at the second generation or more for people who are, more highly educated, Asian American, and Bible-based churches. And then you have more radical secular identity political movements. So one thing that's important to recognize, the term evangelical, and really the group that establishes that, the Lausanne Statement on Lausanne was a group that was established by Billy Graham that includes 95% of evangelicals globally. And basically what they said is that evangelism, relief, development, and advocacy are all important with an emphasis on evangelism. And they had a statement called the holistic mission of the church. All these groups in the middle really would fall under that statement. So it's important for people, the white evangelicals here, to recognize that there's a wide range of being Bible-based or, evangelical. Now, one point that a lot of people make is we do have to be careful to resist the assimilative force of non-biblical secular worldviews. So as I mentioned before, I have seen a good number of people who they engage with the secular worldview and they get assimilated into it. But for a lot of rescue missions, a lot of evangelical ministries need serving the poor, they're going to need to make this transition from kind of the white evangelical model to the highly multi-ethnic model. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize is that there's this thing called the Overton window, and what it is it's basically we will talk about race within our narrow domain. So, a lot of these concentric circles, they'll only allow conversations on race that is within their domain. And there's some reasons for that, and there's some, challenges for that. But recognizing broadly that there are Bible-believing evangelical values, even if they don't call themselves evangelical Christians, that kind of cover all these domains. Now, why do we need to, a lot of the white evangelical ministries need to make this transition to highly multi-ethnic? Well, the country, the United States, is changing, moving from 63% white non-Hispanic to 43%. Many of these ministries are in cities where the white population's already, a minority. And in some, like Detroit, 90% of the population's non-white. And it gets to be increasingly problematic if you have a ministry that's serving the homeless and 95% of your clients are non-white, but 95% of your leadership is white. That becomes increasingly, problematic. So, another reason why this transition needs to happen is just generationally. It's going to happen. So there's a marketing firm that looked at the social issue importance by generation, and it found that the three areas of biggest difference was for millennials and Gen Z was on racial equality, gender equality, and sexual orientation equality. Now, a lot of evangelical ministries are going to say, yes, we need to address racial equality. Yes, we need to address gender equality. They're going to say that we're not going to normalize sexual orientation. Is what a lot of evangelical, ministries will say. So, one of the questions is, how much do you address this? So, and I think with that, part of what you have to consider is how significant are external pressures for change. So, this is a diffusion of innovation curve. One of the phrases I like is the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So there's some ministries that are kind of at the bleeding edge of this. So if you're in Atlanta, Miami, Detroit, San Francisco, South Africa, there's going to be some really, really strong demographic things that are pushing you. So majority of clients are of different race, ethnicity of leadership. Extended community of the city is different racial, ethnic group than the leadership. And younger donors, including evangelicals in your region, strongly value diversity in leadership. So I lived in Boston for 20 years. And a lot of evangelical ministries, if they have this racial mismatch between the leadership and who they're serving, the younger generations are going to say that they don't want to support a model like that, and they're not going to fund that. Now, today, a lot of the funding is coming from boomers and Gen X that may not put as much of value on that. But then, other ministries where there's going to be less immediate need. So if you're in Montana or Ohio where it's predominantly white poverty, there's not as many differences between the leadership and clients. The extended community is white and conservative, and the donors in your region don't place significant value. So part of it is, you need to assess where are you. And part of what I'm going to talk about later is, having your GPS for doing these cross-cultural changes. So one is just, where are you on this curve? So one of the groups that was kind of on the bleeding edge of this, just by the function of their mission, was InterVarsity. So InterVarsity is a Christian campus group that serves largely on secular college campuses that are racially diverse and are more left-leaning. InterVarsity is an evangelical group, so they made some strategic choices. They said they were going to strongly promote gender equality and racial equality, but they developed policies to clearly affirm a traditional view on marriage and sexuality. The result of that was InterVarsity Press became a global leader on the evangelical racial dialogue, but InterVarsity was banned from meeting at several leftist campuses. That created social stigma and limited recruitment, and that caused some InterVarsity chapters to leave InterVarsity just because of too much pressure. Another group was the Southern Baptist that was in the news a lot this year. Southern Baptist Seminary president issued a statement on critical race theory. And then they had a lot of pushback from the Black Southern Baptist pastors. Several of them left over this. And then the Southern Baptist Convention, there's a big question over, were they going to elect someone who is on the far right? But what they did is they elected someone who is very theologically conservative, but also was very strong, with racial reconciliation. So, all of that's to establish kind of a little bit of background. Now what I want to get into is, how do you develop a GPS to grow in your cross-cultural intelligence. So as I mentioned at the beginning, whenever we were training people and we worked with people, we would say, go this way, not that. In terms of whenever we're working in an at-risk neighborhood. So there's really 3 steps, in growing in cultural intelligence. You need to know where you are, you need to know where you want to go, and you need to have a plan for how to get there. So in step 1, there's a lot of parts of step 1. That's the hardest step. So there's going to be a lot of parts of this. So knowing where you are, part 1. So in the missions community, Ralph Winter is one of the most prominent people. He's written a lot of the seminal papers in missions, and he wrote about there's these cultural degrees of separations, and he used the terms E0, E1, E2. And the idea was you're measuring how far your separation is so that you understand the difficulty of the type of evangelism that you're doing. Now, I would say since then, a lot of people have recognized that there's multiple dimensions that are going to inform the separation or distance. That's, could be race or ethnicity. It could be social class. It could be gender. It could be language. It could be immigrant generation, first, second, country of origin. Christian versus non-Christian in terms of the culture, the larger culture, the organizational values alignment. If you're talking about staff, sometimes you may have people who aren't aligned with your organizational values and you're having conflict with them that doesn't have anything to do with, race. It's just they don't agree with your organizational values, right? So, and you learn how each of these dimensions affect your cultural distance based on your knowledge of yourself, other cultures, and experience. Now, part of the reason why this is really important is, the first problem I see with people around race is they just don't deal with the problem. The second problem I see with people around, cross-cultural stuff is they go from, okay, I'm going to avoid it to I'm going to go try to solve the hardest possible problem that I can. I'm going to find someone who's different across as many of these as I can, and or maybe not even, doing that intentionally, but they do. And they go, from first grade level education on, cultural intelligence to advanced PhD material in terms of the level of difficulty. So part of it is just to recognize some of these terms. Now, the field of mission has had concepts like this for decades. Some of these concepts, honestly, they're similar to that of intersectionality. Intersectionality, the big problem with intersectionality, it's that, you need to consider all these things. Now, let me tell you, if, you're a Black man and you're married to an African-American woman and you don't consider the fact that she's both a woman and Black and you're a white man, then, you're really missing something that's important, right? And that someone could say is intersectionality, right? Now, part of where intersectionality goes off is, for a lot of evangelicals, they try to tie in sexual orientation as, a normalized state. And then, people all of a sudden say it's the same as race. And then that creates, concerns around, evangelical values. So, but the point is there's things that we can learn from the field of intersectionality that we can, eat the meat and stick out the bones. Or spit out the bones. So, so with that, if you understand some of these dimensions, then what you can do, and we have our students go through these steps in a cross-cultural management course. We say, you need to know your personal cross-cultural sphere of influence. So we have them go and write out, what is your tier 1? What's the group that you, in evangelism terms would be close to E0? So for me, I grew up in white and Black working class communities. So this is actually how I map out mine. So I'm a little more fluent in white working class communities than I am in Black working class communities, but I'm pretty fluent in both. Then tier 2 would be, poor white, middle class white, or second generation Latino and Asian working class. So these, after several decades of working, I've seen these are the groups that I can serve reasonably well. These are the groups, this next tier is more of a stretch for me. I can still serve this tier reasonably well. So Black, lower income or middle class, first generation, Latino or Asian, upper middle class, or international. And then there's people out here that is everyone else. Now, the point of this isn't to say, well, I'm just going to serve my tier 1 people, because honestly, that would create a racial bias, right? Which is going to be problematic. But it's going to recognize that if I go into a relationship, I'm going to recognize that I need to be more intentional about a lot of these things, and to recognize that, it might be more challenging for me. So then the next part of this, so part 3, is to think about, and John Maxwell has something called the law of the lid. And the idea behind the law of the lid is it says, if your leadership rate is an 8, then your effectiveness can never be greater than a 7. That's because you can only effectively lead those at a 7 or below. Now, this is kind of a corollary to this, is that your leadership level will vary across different cross-cultural groups. So someone who's a level 8 leader with white middle-class men might be a level 5 leader with Black upper middle-class women. Or, you have to understand your own cross-cultural fluency, but to recognize this, and each person is going to have different cross-cultural sphere of influence across various groups, given their cultural background, identity, and personality. Now, how this plays out organizationally is, so you might have a white male middle class leader, and then this is, what his leadership level is, across different racial groups, and then he might supervise a level 7 leader that's white male, but then he supervises a level 5 leader that is, working class female, and a Black middle class leader that's level 5 leader, and a Latina level 3 leader. And the point is that if this person had someone who was a level 7, leader on one of these other areas, they may not be able to effectively lead that person, because they're essentially paying a cross-cultural lack of cultural intelligence tax with that particular group. And what happens in organizations, though, is this kind of creates a bias in the organizational chart. So, this white male middle class level 7 leader can supervise a much larger staff, whereas some of the others, it doesn't work as well. And then that also filters down to the clients. If you end up having senior leadership that's disproportionately white, often you'll find, and you'll have to assess the data in your organization, but often you'll find that clients from other race and class groups don't have as strong a success rate. So that's where you get into part 4, knowing your organizational cross-cultural sphere of influence. So, one way of doing this is to draw this out. And so this is City Vision's cross-cultural sphere of influence. So evangelicals serving the poor, largely adult, white and Black working class. Then Christians and nonprofit professions, participants from evangelical programs serving the poor, and then there's other groups that we serve. So this group, people in this group, they're like, wow, I can't believe there's a school that is really meets all of my needs. Now this group is like, wow, you meet most of my needs, and this group is like, yeah, you kind of meet some of my needs, but you're stretching it in other ways. So. Some of the international students that we've served, we don't serve them as well as we do a lot of the U.S. students. So one, you can write this out, but another is you can actually get to data. So conduct an evaluation to get an honest measure of your organization's cultural sphere of influence. So you can, with your clients, assess the demographics of participants, assess the success rates and complaints of clients across key cultural dimensions. Look at, do you have adequate staffing that's culturally close to those to be able to meet their needs? Is there a difference in success rates across racial groups, other factors? If success rates are much lower for key target groups, then, what's causing that? And, so there's other groups that are out there that have diversity forums. Some largely secular funders right now require these diversity forms, but they can give you a model and you can modify it to have, the dimensions that are relevant for you. So City Vision did a cross-cultural assessment, and we looked at, what were the factors that had that improved success rate. And we saw, people who are paying themselves. So that's a measure of income. Then factors that had limited impact on success rate, race, gender, and Pell Grants had, like probably less than 5% impact on success rate. And then lower success rate, honestly, younger, we mainly serve adults, people who don't bring in transfer credits, people taking federal student loans. But the most telling thing out of this analysis, and for many organizations, this is the most telling. It isn't, the groups that you have that aren't having good success. It's the groups that in your community, you might be serving, but they don't even show up. So, right now, the groups that we're not serving as well as we'd like, especially, are those who have an Asian American and Latino background. So all of that was kind of point one. Where are you on your GPS? The second is know where you want to go. And what you want to do is you want to use appropriate training and leaders to expand your cultural intelligence. So using this map that I had, so, where is your organization? If your organization's white evangelical churches and ministries, your starting point might be some of these authors here. Because a lot of they're not read exclusively by white evangelical churches and ministries, but they're the groups that they're like the A-list that get the highest ratings. As I've worked with a lot of white evangelical churches and ministries, as they write, on these topics. And then there's highly multi-ethnic Bible-based churches and ministries. So there's a lot of groups, a lot of books from InterVarsity Press, John Perkins, Brenda Salter McNeil, Miles McPherson. You can look up some of their books. And part of it is, I'll keep going. Working class, Black, upper middle class, and then radical groups. Now, and there's different leaders. A lot of these writers here, they're writing for Black and white audiences, or people of color and white audiences. But a lot of these, or Latino in one case. But I would have to say, whenever I read them, I think their primary audience they're writing for is people of color. That doesn't mean that, white folk aren't going to benefit from them. But, if you're watching a movie that the audience is intended for African American population and you don't get some of the jokes, then that's part of it, right? So the question is, where are you and where are you trying to go? So say you're a white evangelical church and ministry and you're going to try to move over here. You're going to have people all over the board, right? So you're going to have some people who came from a separatist white fundamentalist background. You're going to have some people who are already over here, some people who might be, over here. But the question is, where do you want to start the conversation to help educating people on this? And you might start here and then start to move people over here. But if you start on some of, Robert Romero, he wrote a book called Brown Church. He is, a Christian who's writing largely for a secular audience, and Christians who are engaging with a secular audience. I would say his audience is, both of these. So he is a Christian that is representing Christians really well, in that context, and but someone who is, over here is probably going to have a hard time appreciating what he's writing. It's part of what I'm getting at. Whereas actually Sheila Wise Rowe, her book is highly accessible, I think, to everyone, just because it's more story based. So ultimately, you want to look at where is it you're trying to go, and then get a training plan around that. So, and you want to have a plan. So step 3 is have a plan to grow your cultural intelligence personally and organizationally. So you're going to work, on your head or cognitive, reading, taking a course, watching videos, learning a language, your heart, cross-cultural friendships, training in cross-cultural churches, a minority immersion, being supervised cross-culturally, your hands, managing cross-culturally, working cross-culturally with peers, serving cross-culturally clients. Now, one of the tools we provide to you is our City Vision Institute. We provide some of our courses available for free. We've had over 25,000 people take our courses. 3 of our courses that are focused on these topics, and these are in levels of difficulty. Cross-cultural management and ministry is the most accessible, and that really can start with people from just about anywhere. Leadership and under-resourced communities is more in the middle. And then Christian community development. For most people, our course on Christian community development is going to be the most challenging. And you can take these for free on our website. You can pay to take them. We also, on our website, if you look at the resources section, we have a list of recommended books that you can look at. We'll be continuing to expand it on that. So with that, I hope you find this helpful. If you do find it helpful, share it with your friends. If you don't find it helpful, I don't want to, have some sort of flame war on YouTube. So, we hope that you benefit somehow from this and it becomes a part of your experience. So thanks a lot. And I hope you can go to our website at cityvisioninstitute.org. And again, if you're interested in taking these courses, so City Vision University provides bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and for Christians that are serving the poor and the addicted. So we hope that you take a look at that too. Thanks a lot.